Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the 138th episode of Stories of Service, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I'm the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today, as we always do, I have another amazing guest. And I always love it when I have guests that I have worked with in my professional life, and then they've become personal friends. And that is what has happened with Chris Hyde. Chris, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing great. Doing great. Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you too. So Chris and I met because he was former SHAPE Chief Public Affairs Officer. SHAPE, we'll talk about it. It is the higher headquarters for what we call all the Allied Command operations, lower level commands that report up to the headquarters military command. But we'll go into that more later. First off, I just want to say the fact that I have this opportunity. It's rare that I get to talk to somebody who has so many similar experiences, but so many different experiences in the military. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to talk about a nonprofit that he is a part of now that is on a mission to handle the massive pet overpopulation issue that has happened in Ukraine as a result of the war. And it's more than just welfare issues. It's an issue of disease. It's an issue that could affect the entire EU, and it's an important thing that we need to talk about. So Chris Hyde enlisted in the U.S. Army in December 1995 and served just over 2 years as a personal actions clerk assigned to the 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, before his selection to attend the U.S. Army Officer Candidate School in early 1998. He commissioned as an adjunct general second lieutenant in June of 1998 and served in many different capacities as an AG officer over the next several years: detachment executive officer, postal platoon leader, MEPS operation officer, and AG detachment commander. Then he was selected in 2007 to serve as a PAO, public affairs officer, and key public affairs billets at all echelons for 18 years, internationally, on operation, and in garrison. He also deployed to Diyala, Iraq in September 2008 with the 125th Stryker Brigade Combat Team as the SBCT's PAO and served as PA planner for the ISAF Joint Command throughout 2011 in Kabul, Afghanistan. And we're going to talk more about Afghanistan. His other public affairs assignments, this was not his first NATO command. He also served as the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps in the UK, training with an industry fellow with the Siemens Corporation. He was also a division public affairs officer for the U.S. Army 2nd Infantry Division, ROK U.S. Combined Division in the Republic of Korea. He served as Chief PAO for the U.S. Army's 1st Corps and completed his Army public affairs career serving as the Chief of Public Affairs, Deputy Director of Strategic Communications at NATO's Allied Command, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe, or SHAPE in Mons, Belgium. And he is now retired from military service in March of 2024. Welcome again, Chris.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
So first off, I always ask people who have served in the military, which is 99.9% of my guests, where were you born and raised, and what inspired you from your childhood to join the service?
So where was I born in the United States, and then
Yes.
okay. Born in St. Petersburg, Florida. It's
Okay.
funny because I like my parents lived there for a year. So I was born in Florida, but kind of lived all over. Georgia, South Carolina is kind of we finally lighted in Charleston. So I say I'm from Charleston, but it's been like 30 years. You know, the military deal. It's like you live everywhere.
Oh, so
Spend
your
campaigns
family
everywhere.
was also military.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, no. Ironically enough, no. My dad was he was a nurse, a male nurse. It was an interesting thing. It's fun trying to explain that to people. But both my parents were nurses. They were medical, and so like we hopped from job to job, or he did rather. So like every time he went to a different place, it felt like a military upbringing. And it's
Mhm.
funny too because he was an Army reservist and a chief nurse for at that time a MASH unit.
Mhm.
So Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, I think. Yeah, that's changed 7 ways from Sunday since then. But he used to joke that he was the chief nurse and he was Halip Houlihan, but not as good looking. And that was always his. He had a good sense of humor. He was dry. But anyway, yeah. So we kind of moved all over, and so for me, the military was an extension more of like not really his generation, but my grandparents' generation. You know, the greatest generation. You know, I had I had a grandfather who served in World War II, but he had been in the Army for 30 years. Like he kind of went from buck private as a 16-year-old who lied about his age and said he was 18.
Hmm.
So he joined the Army back in the mid 30s, and then he retired sometime in the mid 60s. And I grew up with that generation. So I think that I heard so many terrific war stories, really, literally, from all that generation that I loved the sort of tales of camaraderie and the
Yep.
team thing. And although I went to music school and I was a musician, and embarrassingly, I went to a protest for Desert Shield and Storm back in college. It's funny. It's funny now because I have this 28-year long career, but yeah, because I was upset my dad was going to have to go to the desert, and I wasn't sure that it was worthwhile. And so I exercised my right as a at that
And
time
as
a
a
19-year-old
citizen,
to go
yeah,
complain about it.
right.
Um,
But you
but
had parents that were in the helping profession and did
yes,
live a life of service, and I think that was still ingrained in you, service.
yeah.
Oh, and by the way, by the way, Jose, has said hello and that you are a
Oh,
legend. Jose, Velazquez, I'm sure you know him.
yep, I
He
do. I do. Jose, good to see you there. Yeah.
yeah, so,
Uh,
I think that's the reason why a lot of us, join the military. We just see that as a way of giving back and being a part of that cause that's greater than ourselves.
Yeah, no, I think that was what I was inspired by, was the fact that so much of that generation seemed to drop everything and go into the war effort. And I get it; it was a different world, and a lot of them were worried about safety, security, all that kind of stuff. But what I was always inspired by was not necessarily the I was in this battle. It was the fact that that generation, all the people I talked to, would talk about all the people that they met, knew, and kept up with. And my grandfather, sad, died at 70, lung cancer, all kinds of complications. The man was a chain smoker. So anyway, but I was inspired by the fact that at his funeral, full military honors, he was he was a retired master sergeant, NCO's NCO. I mean, he was that guy.
Mhm.
And I was inspired by the fact that at his funeral, there were probably like two-thirds of the people there were not family. They were like all of his buddies that he knew throughout the years that he kept up with that all came to his funeral. And I met all these people as a teenager who so why are you here? Because I was impetuous teenager. I was like, yeah, so how do you know my grandpa? Oh, I served with him back in, and that became the thing. I was really inspired by that. And I kept looking for that. And even as a musician, I was into accompanying, I was into collaborative work, I was into the team thing. I could do the stage bit, but I always enjoyed theater and I enjoyed things that required a team. So I guess for me, coupled with what I grew up hearing and then what I was looking for,
Mhm.
this idea of being part of something bigger than yourself. That's why I kind of led to the military, which is funny because I'm sure all my musician friends would be like, "Huh, you did what?" In fact,
Well,
some of them did do that,
yeah,
but
and
it's
it's
God, I
such a
loved it.
diversion but I think for us creatives, it is one of those things where we can find that little niche, eventually. And like myself, you're prior enlisted, so you didn't start off so going, okay, I'm going to be a storyteller and do something that's
Yeah,
somewhat in the creative arts. It was more, okay, I'm gonna be I think you said personnelman, I think is what I read,
yeah, yeah.
and so you were an admin, a personal actions clerk, right?
Yes. Yep. And actually, I loved the job. I mean, I was at Bragg, now Liberty, um, and it was an interesting place to be. It is a hub of all kinds of activity in the U.S. Army. It is the place to be seen and see things. So it was a neat place to be. But what I loved about the actions job was that I got to meet all kinds of people as a very junior soldier, that were either retiring or they were trying to get a different assignment or they were whatever. Like every actions that the personal actions form,
Mm,
kind of led to all kinds of different things. So I got to interact with a lot of people and meet a lot of people. I mean, and I had my favorites that I would help them out on something, and then they would just drop by to say hello,
that's
and
so
that
cool.
became kind of I would look forward to seeing. Oh, that NCO would come over to say hi, or whatever,
Yeah.
or I'd see them on post. So
Yeah.
I loved it. It was a neat job. Yeah.
Cool. No, and then you went off to Army Officer Candidate School, we talked that night at dinner when we were in Paris at the NATO Communicators Conference about how you overcame some hard things during was that during Officer Candidate School or was that during boot camp? I can't remember off the top of my
That was
head.
well, boot camp was difficult. I mean, boot camp was difficult from the standpoint that I had a master's degree in music and that I went to Army boot camp and at Fort Jackson, and it was a bit of a shock to go
Yeah.
from this very intellectual environment of artists that are musicians that are talking about stuff, to I just need to be able to pass basic rifle marksmanship. Like I need to be able to shoot.
Yeah,
I
right.
had never done any of that stuff, so that was a big shock. But OCS was hard just because it was such a mental game. In those
Mhm.
days, they were still hazing like the heck out of people. I mean, not that anybody would have admit that now, but oh yeah, a lot of very little sleep, a lot of those things, and I get it. They were trying to stress us out to see who was going to be calm under pressure when leading troops, and but I went to it with the idea that I had served as an enlisted soldier, and I felt like and I'm not gonna disparage anybody who has been to an academy or ROTC or any of that, but as an OCS guy, I like the fact that I have actually walked in the enlisted boots. I had to do the things that
Mhm.
other people are ordering you to do, and some of it was pretty silly, or some of it didn't make a whole lot of sense, and
Right.
so it's easy. I feel like I'm qualified now to say, as a colonel, I'm not gonna make you do that because I had to do that when I was a specialist, and it was stupid. Or
Right.
it was, ingratiatingly, yeah, had no point on anything. So yeah, I bet OCS was difficult. But then I got the dream assignment. We went to Bavaria after that. I got the Germany assignment, and it was hard to. It was hard. That was what motivated me through most of that. If I'm being honest, that was going to Germany after all this. Don't screw it up, Chris. You got to
Yeah.
graduate. Yeah.
Yep.
So it was difficult, but I'm proud of myself for doing it. I guess
Yeah,
that's
and
look
I
back on
think
it
that's
as experience.
how we all see hard things. Like, I know for myself, my hardest, training evolution was the helo dunker, which you have to go through while you're in aircrew school, and it's this capsule where they place you underwater, and then they throw you upside down, and you have to do 4
Oh,
rides, and 2 of the rides are blindfolded. One is you can go out the door next to you, which is, this open window, but then 2 of the evolutions, you have to go out the main cabin door. And so you really have to understand how to feel your way around an
all right.
open and it's one of those things where you can feel very claustrophobic and there's a lot of mental toughness I think that goes into that or at least did for me. But every time I've had to do it, I've passed, but it's been
Wow.
incredibly difficult. But when I'm done, there's just that
Yeah.
rush and that high you get because it's like I achieved something hard.
Oh, yeah. For me, it was land navigation at night, and at Fort Benning, whatever, is that more now? I think Fort Moore. Anyway, yeah, and that was crazy. I mean, I was hiking around, and my mind was getting to intermittent stream on the map, that was a roaring torrent. And it was Indiana Jones moment of flinging myself across the river, hoping that I was going to land on. So yeah, and it was just another day in the job. It was that school thing,
Mhm.
but I got
Sure.
done with that. And I passed, and I was like, yes, because if you didn't pass that in those days, you had to go back every weekend until you
Mhm.
passed.
Yeah.
And it was yeah, and all the stories of lost lieutenants and stuff like that are maybe apt. So anyway, I was happy that I was not going to be that lieutenant. I could land nav. That was yeah. So anyway,
Yeah. No, I
fun
get
stuff.
it. I was put back a week for the helo dunker training in Pensacola and had to
Uh,
spend a whole week with a instructor just in this, but I didn't it was called a Heath chair, I think. It was this
okay.
chair that they would put you upside down, and it just over and over again basically desensitized me
Wow.
to
Wow.
to that feeling, but I was like, "I'm getting through aircrew school. I'm getting I'm getting my gold wings." So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was one of those things I was determined to do it.
Yeah.
So, you spent a few years as an officer, but you are not a PAO immediately, like many of
Sure.
us, right? So, you were a
Right.
detachment executive officer, postal platoon leader, and then you found your way over to the public affairs community. What inspired you to do that?
Oh, I was at that point in my career where I was at the 10-year mark. For
Okay.
those of you, I mean, I'm sure everybody, like you're at the 10-year mark. You're at well, I could go another 10 and I could retire, or I can just get out. I'll go do the things. We were in Alaska at the time, ironically enough, where I'm now, and I was a strength manager. It was just a lot of number crunching. I mean,
Mm,
you know
yeah.
what? I enjoy personnel, but what I noticed through that entire walk was that so much of it, like I went into it because ironically, and I mean, it sounds stupid now, but whatever, it was a decision that you're making in your 20s. I went into personnel in the first place because I thought I'm good at writing. I'll do a lot of writing. Yeah, it was a lot of writing, but it was not creative writing, and there was a big difference in that. And so I got to being a captain and a detachment commander, and it was just a lot. Like, it was a
A lot of
lot of all that kind
administrative
of it
work.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I knew that there was a public affairs community, and I had been told repeatedly by my branch at the time, "You will never get into public affairs. AG, Adjutant General, will never let you go because we never have enough people." And by that point, it was 2000. We were at 2006, right? So there's a lot
Yes.
going on in the world, and so I put in as a Hail Mary pass of maybe it will work. I threw it in and said, "Look, I have an art background. I'm a musician in my past. I wrote for the newspaper in my college. I can edit. I should be public affairs." I thought no one will ever pick me up. So I remember getting pulled into my boss at the time, who was the G1 for U.S. Army Alaska, and he said, "Well, I've got good news and bad news, or maybe it's just bad news. I don't know." And I'm like, "Great, what a good setup, sir. Appreciate that." "Yeah, so what is it?" "Well, you didn't get picked up for major below zone." I'm like, Okay. But you got public affairs? I didn't know. Was that a thing for you? I mean, were you hoping to do that?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, yeah." So I was the happiest guy. I skipped down the hallway, and got put into it. But a lot of it was I like being I like channeling the creative part of my brain. It is difficult to have spent really most of my childhood, teenage years, college life thinking consistently about being creative, and then go into a very black and white sort of world where
Mhm.
you're not being paid to be creative necessarily. Creative maybe in planning, but as a lieutenant, people look, just make sure everybody's evaluation reports are on time.
Right.
Make sure that everybody gets their orders relatively on time, right? Whereas, public affairs, I thought, no, I think I could be creative there, and maybe it would be maybe it would be. I sort of enjoy being the weird creative guy in the room that's sitting in a room full of people who kind of don't understand it, but they're happy you're doing it because they don't have to do it, or maybe. Yeah, no, I
God,
mean, really, yeah, you're the guy that's gonna step into the fray. Look, they'll happily
totally.
go into a live fire, but put them in front of a camera and, "Oh my god,
No.
please do this, Chris. Please go do that."
Mhm.
Yeah. So, I found that to be oddly appealing, so I thought it would be kind of a neat thing that would keep me in for a little bit longer, and I wouldn't pull my hair out being bored.
Right.
So, and that was the logic. So then
Mhm.
when I got it, it was sort of a massive rush. It was a super, like, "Okay, great. I think I can keep doing this Army thing. I love the camaraderie. I just wanna enjoy it."
And then
So,
immediately, it looks like you went to Afghanistan, like, it wasn't even that long after you became a PAO,
well, I
you started
mean, it
deployed.
it was Iraq and then Afghanistan, but yeah, no, I
Yeah.
was only a PAO for maybe 2 years, I think, and then, I was working at U.S. Army Alaska. I enjoyed it. It was a bunch of I mean, sorry, it was just a bunch of old folks. It was a lot of old retirees that were GS, and they kinda nurtured me along. It was like being with my parents' generation, kinda helping me out, and they
Yeah,
were nice, and some of them had been there for, like, 40 years, and
yeah.
so it was just I mean, even in the day, Rich was kind of known before it became 11th, now it's a division headquarters, not but at the time, it was Fort Hunting and Fishing, right? Like, people went there to retire,
Mhm.
and it was a pretty place. So it was a neat place to be. But I had a mentor at the time. Yeah, Wayne Shanks was the name, Colonel Shanks. He was the U.S. Army Pacific PAO down in Hawaii, and he called me up and he said, "Look, Chris, I know you're really enjoying it up there, but you're a major and you're a PAO and you've been to Dinfos, and you probably should go do a deployment somewhere, man. You should go someplace dusty and dangerous, like to prove your mettle." And I know that the Stryker Brigade up in Fairbanks they don't have a PAO because they're a Stryker Brigade and they don't have PAOs. And so, would you consider? So that
Mhm.
became Sir, hold one. I got to talk to better half on that. Household six needs to have a vote. So let me go talk to my wife. So I went home, talked to Sonia about it, and she said, "Yeah, no, I mean, what in real terms, what does that mean?" The pragmatic military spouse at this point been doing it for a while, and I said, "Well, it would mean that we'd stay in Alaska for probably another 2 years." And she said, "I'm good. Go ahead and go." That was I'll miss you. The kids will miss you. But
Mhm.
hey, I don't want to move for another couple of years. And if it keeps us here longer, that was kind of the logic. So I went back and said, sure, I'll do it. So but then I was in this weird, redheaded stepchild thing of, I wasn't assigned to the unit, I was attached to the unit. And so then I had to not only deploy, but then also prove myself to the guys and gals who had been in this unit for a while and already done everything. So, but that was great. I think that was it was one of my favorite assignments. It was in Diyala in 2008, 9. We were there for a year. And, there was just a lot of media. I had embedded media all the time. We had this, I had to learn a lot because I did not know how to do InDesign. I had never published like that before, but the brigade commander really wanted a magazine, like printed,
Mm,
5,000 copies a month.
yep.
So I had to learn a lot. Loved my team, and then came back from that, and then moved to my next assignment in the UK at the Ark. And then we deployed to Afghanistan. And that was completely different. Like I went to Afghanistan thinking it would be like Iraq, a little team doing my public affairs stuff. And they said, you're going to be a public affairs planner. And I was underwhelmed. I
Yeah,
did
because
not
planning
really want to do that.
is not as exciting as execution. We all know this. I mean,
No,
the
no. Yeah.
planning is important and we need to do
Oh,
it,
yeah.
but
No.
it's the execution where you really feel like you've got that return on investment because you're doing the things of our craft. And
Right.
so, yeah, I can see where that was probably frustrating for somebody like yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but because I was there and I'm just kind of weird and artsy and all that kind of stuff. I was sitting in a meeting one day in this huge, it was CJ35. It was future operations planning. There were 85 people in that team. It was massive, and I was but one of two PAOs. There were two IOs and one PSYOPer in our little communications team. And I saw these guys going down to downtown to, we were up at the airfield, and they were going down to the Ministry of Defense for the Afghans, and they were meeting with them on this big plan. And I it felt like a kid saying if I could go play, but I just went over to the guy going down there and I said, "Well, do you have a public affairs person on this? Like, is there an Afghan PAO somewhere that I need to talk to? Like, I'm writing a plan for them. Shouldn't I talk to them and ask
Right.
them before I start writing plans for them?" And nobody's ever done that, Chris. Yeah, let me check. So, like 2 days later, I was on the trip down, and then I started linking in with all these Afghans and building that network. And after a while, I found myself mentoring Afghan PAOs, and I found myself, outside the wire all the time. And so it turned from something that I was dreading, it's just
That's so
writing
cool.
public affairs guidance, to like actually mentoring people and trying to think about what makes public affairs tick. And this was all as a major, so I felt like it was
Wow.
defining for me.
Do you think that's also part of I know that you also feel, as so many veterans do, very emotional when it comes to Afghanistan, and because you had that special relationship and that rapport with so many people in Afghanistan, do you think that was part of the reason why you feel so connected to that place?
I mean, I've thought about it a lot. I think for me, I can say I identified with the Afghans. That would be largely an error in that, but I liked them, and as much as they were dysfunctional, um, and had a hard time getting along, a lot of tribalism, a lot of ethnic stuff that we'll just never understand as Westerners. I admired their passion, and I found some of them to be so almost inspiring, and like, they had this innate ability to, like, once you were in there, if the, however many cups of tea book, right? Um, Drank a lot of tea in Afghanistan, a lot of tea, but I found that the more I opened up about who I was as a person, everything from my spirituality, which is, it's a dangerous line to walk, but, spirituality, your faith, your family, what you like, the ice cream that's your favorite,
Yeah, who you
whatever.
are. Mhm.
Yeah, once I kind of made a maybe risky step at trying to be more than just another major PAO from the US, but being Chris, who wants to come in and talk about your family, how's your, whatever. The more I did that, the more they opened up and the more they were willing to listen. And but then I had to listen too and listen to the things that they felt like were concerns that I didn't think. So yeah, I came away kind of oddly inspired from that year. It sucked being away from my family, and it always does. But I felt like it was worthwhile. So for me, yeah, watching everything fall apart, watching it disintegrate. I deeply worry about the people that I knew. I
Mhm.
sit around. I mean, I think about it every day. But the moment that Afghanistan comes up in the news, I immediately think, oh, I wonder what happened to Colonel Abdul Hai. I mentored that guy for a while. He was a really nice man. Or my interpreter that I had for 8 months. Like I mean, the guy got married while I was over there. He gave me a gift for my wife because I let him have 3 days off to get married, which at the time felt ridiculous. Like, you're getting married. Yes, you should have some time off. But all that stuff, yeah, I care very deeply for the country, and I really wanted it to work out better. But you know, it is what it is at this point, I guess.
It's a
Have to
it's
move
a
on.
it's a tough issue, and really, I haven't even scratched the surface on my show of covering it, in the level of depth that I'd like to, because I really do feel that it needs to be very deeply examined, because it is an example of what right now is seen as a failure in the eyes of a lot of the American people. And I think that we need to understand, was it a failure? And if so, why? And what can we do better going forward to prevent something like that from happening again? And I think the people like yourself who've been there are such important voices in that. And to that point, I know you recently did an interview with a journalist who's putting together the stories of people
Mhm.
who served in Afghanistan. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was kind of an idea that we had when I was at Shape. Yeah, well, it was right after the fall, and we were kind of sitting around with my team, and we said, I really feel like that at the end of the day, the people that are going to get the short end of this one are not the politicians that made a decision, are not the country leaders that made a decision, are not the industrialists that made a decision. It will be average, Joe or Jolene who spent however many years over there. I mean, I spent a year. I know people that had multiple deployments to Afghanistan, and from different nations. Though those are the people that are going to sit there and wonder why they did it, or like why was I even over there if this was just going to fall apart anyway? What was the whole point? And I also thought, to your point, I mean, I don't remember thinking when I was there, I'm gonna do a half-ass job and not do any. Like I really put everything, every fiber of my being into trying to be successful, and I genuinely wanted them. I wanted the Taliban to die a bloody death. I wanted the Haqqani network to just go the heck away. I wanted to go find Bin Laden, and actually, I was over there when they got Bin Laden, which was kind of crazy. But I wanted all those things, and everybody I talked to wanted those things. So it is difficult to then look at it and go, I didn't feel like a failure. I'm not being arrogant about that statement, but I did a damn good job. You know what? Most of the people I was on the team with did a damn good job,
Yeah.
and so what we started talking about is, we're always very concerned with veteran health. We're always concerned with mental health. We're trying to encourage our service members
Mhm.
when they have problems, go seek help for that, and try destigmify the whole therapy bit or seeing professionals in behavioral health. But are we not setting up a problem by telling people, yeah, you were a failure, or no, it didn't work out, and you just need to move on, Or when I would mention Afghanistan, even as Shape, when I would mention it, it would be, hey, look, we're moving on to the next thing. And, maybe fortunately, totally misfortunately for Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that became the thing, and everybody waved way off of Afghanistan because that was the closer crocodile to the canoe at that point, and still is. But it did seem disingenuous, and I felt like we should talk about it. And if not, and not to benefit the greater public, but to give people a voice to talk about what went right, but probably more importantly, what didn't go right or what they're
Right.
troubled by.
I
And
agree.
so, yeah, I did that interview, and then I found a journalist who was very interested that I had worked with previously in England, in the UK. Nadira Tudor is her name, and so she was working on a project at the time for school, and she said, "Yeah, well, I'll come talk to your people, and do you have people that are really going to do this?" And we had a waiting list for a long time of people that wanted to talk about this. So I would say for the audience that we were looking at, which is the service member, I think it was successful in that regard, and that it did get people talking,
It does.
and
It
then
does.
that's, I think, important.
It does, and I think that the people who served over there and had those experiences, it's important, and I believe therapeutic for them to not only seek behavioral health, but then to also share their stories and talk to people who've had those same similar experiences and who can understand what that meant to them. Because I think that until we talk about problems or we talk about how we feel about things, we can't get better as a community. And that's
Yeah.
why I'm so open and transparent with my platforms and the people that I have on and the kind of conversations that I seek to have is because I know that having conversations and talking about things in open forums where people aren't afraid to speak up leads to healing and it
Yeah.
leads to problem solving.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's funny. I mean, as a communicator, of course, I feel like people should talk to each other, and I strongly believe. Well, I mean, Afghanistan was a perfect case. Like face-to-face communication was the best way to talk to people in Afghanistan, right? Like they really, a lot of them are illiterate. They don't have TVs. They don't have
Mhm.
electronics, whatever. So, like talking to Afghans was always like the big problem over there, and trying to figure out how to talk to Afghans. Like you want to spread a message among the Afghan populace. How do you do that? And a lot, what we kept coming back to was face-to-face. But I actually think people just in general get way more out of having a kind of frank discussion where I'm not saying that you don't set up boundaries, probably do. And for a talkaholic like me, you definitely have to set up a boundary. But I feel like that there is an element of trying to remove boundaries so that people don't feel like that, oh my God, I can't talk about that thing because then like maybe you do need to talk about that thing. I mean, nothing hit me more than when I was in Korea after that, or I had an NCO who was just not doing well. And then we figured out that through a lot of uncomfortable conversations face to face that he had had a rollover in a vehicle, and the guy sitting next to him in the vehicle, in the military vehicle, it was a striker, I think, or no, it was a MRAP rollover, died, and he lived, and he had survivor guilt, and he started drinking, and he had been drinking to the point where it was blackout drunk, and it was getting worse and worse, and then we figured out that he had traumatic brain injury, and it was only because my NCOIC at the time was willing to have an uncomfortable conversation with a junior NCO, you know, who was just not doing well. That he and so he went, he agreed, he saw help, he got treated, and he was like I'm gonna say polar opposite. He was still him, but he was a very much happier, So I feel like Afghanistan and other things, you just have to have uncomfortable conversations, and you have to be willing to be open about it.
Yep, I would
And
100% agree with you, and that's the reason why I do the same thing with my team. We do the same thing in sometimes some of our shape calls.
yeah,
Sometimes
yeah,
we talk about things that are not easy to talk about because
yeah,
it is until we have those conversations and we get those things out in the open and we're in an environment where people are listening to the things that we're bringing up, we're not going to solve those issues. And
no,
so tell me a little bit. I want to move a little forward to
sure.
now you've come back from Afghanistan and then one of your next pivotal tours is can we move on to NATO or is there something else you want to cover before that?
I mean, I was in Korea for 2 years. I would say Korea is a hard one to talk about because it's like they used to joke that we were fighting the same 1 year because most people go there for a year. That
Mhm.
they're fighting the same 1 year campaign 60 times or something like that. Because you're constantly worried about something bad happening, and you're like a speed bump in the middle of whatever happens. But you kind of have to keep living and kind of keep doing things. And I had this unique team where I had half my team were Korean, so I learned a lot, and it just kind of continued the track for me in my entire career of this great love for working internationally and trying to figure out how different nations fit. So Korea was important to me because then years later I made it to shape, and that was the dream assignment for me. I never thought I would get that billet and go to Mons, Belgium.
I
Although
mean, that's a pivotal job, Chris.
it's a
I mean,
cool
to
job.
be like the top NATO military communicator.
Yeah,
It's
it was a very, very neat job. I would be lying if I said I don't miss it. I mean, because I do to a degree.
Yeah,
It was a terrific job to retire out of, because there was really nothing else I wanted to do after that point. It was
right.
kind of
Like,
like,
top that.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was the top thing, and to have some pretty big things happen while I was there, and a lot of a lot of talk about strategic communications. We've had those conversations. A lot of how it all works, working with nations and trying to convince them to build public affairs equity, all that kind of good stuff. It was
And
cool.
every nation is different. That's the thing. Every nation has its own needs
Yep.
and priorities and cultural things, and it's tough. It is very interesting being in Europe because I'd never done a European assignment before I got to Allied Maritime Command, and I had no idea that in all these European countries, I mean, people are people. We're all the same at our core, but there's so many different little isms about certain nations and not
Mhm.
and sensitivities and I always say to my team, I mean, we're the most exposed team other than ops. I can't think of anybody else who faces more exposure on a day-to-day basis of a word being wrong or
Yeah.
a clip showing a flag that it shouldn't show
Oh
or
yeah, yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
just these little things that you might not know because you don't know the nuances of what 32 nations at any given time are sensitive about. And that's why
Oh, yeah.
even for me, all my stories go through our deputy commander, and I don't even fight that. I don't care
No.
because I know those stories have a shelf life, and I like the fact that there is an extra set of eyes that's looking at it.
Oh yeah.
Those kinds of things, but those are the things that you have to be a very experienced PAO to serve in NATO. I
Oh
feel,
yeah.
or a
Yeah.
very you have to understand how to work things on very many levels. But in some ways, it's so rewarding. You get to work with so many different kinds of people.
I I loved it, and there were big moments. I mean, like being in Finland and Helsinki, and
Mhm.
and sitting at the table with their chief of defense for breakfast, I think, or lunch or something, and he just leaned over the table and he said, "Well, we're going to be a member." And I'm like, "Oh, really? I mean, it's still like up for it." Yeah, no, I just had a conversation with and whoever it was, and he said, "Yeah." And then it was like knowing the finale winner for like a TV show or something like that had been running for a long time and nobody knew, and you had this like kind of trusted information that you couldn't talk about. I guess now looking back of it,
Mhm.
it would feel like, well, of course they were going to be, but I mean nobody knew.
Mhm.
Nobody knew how it was going to vote, how it was going to go. There were a lot of those moments, and then there were the not so great moments, like the two nations that really kind of tolerate each other,
Mhm.
and they have to find the median line in there, and
Yeah.
you have to be this person to say, hey, let's look at the Venn diagram. You're here, they're there. There's a
Mhm.
little bit of an overlap. Let's try to find a
Right.
little bit of the overlap.
Yeah.
But in some kind of weird way, I enjoyed that challenge. It was fun. It was never boring,
No.
and
No.
never
And
felt like I had a
we
boring.
meet the most amazing people,
Yeah.
like Oana, if she sees this
Oh yeah,
broadcast,
yeah,
she's an example of someone that you don't get to meet people like that in everyday life. At
yeah,
least I didn't. And then people who are just so internationally minded.
yeah,
I think that before I came to NATO, I had my US hat on. And now even as I do my podcasts and I think about issues, I think about issues now internationally.
yeah.
And even like the animal issues, which I know we're going to transition into with the Ukraine charity that you're working with now. I never thought about the animals issue from an international standpoint. I thought about my pet issues and puppy mills and pet stores and things like that, but I
Mhm.
never thought about some of these international issues that you have to think about. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine that just made NATO so much more.
Yeah,
Um, I think important, so much more um, cohesive, stronger. I mean, all
mhm.
that did really was bring all these nations together in more of a stance of solitary. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
bringing the
yeah,
alignment. It brought people together in a way that I
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know if they would have otherwise.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was cool to be in NATO and watch it congeal a little bit
Mhm.
better. Like people were already getting along, but I felt like that a lot of the disagreements and spats and a lot of the crazy, I always when people went, all right, so unfortunately, and I don't know if you've heard this one, but I heard it growing up in the military, I would hear that NATO actually stood for no action, talk only. And I would get really
Oh, yes,
pissed off
or
because I
nothing
thought,
after 2 o'clock. I've heard
right,
that one
yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I served in the UK with the ARC, and that was NATO Rapid Deployment Corps, deployed with them. Largely British run, so I know you're in the UK
too.
now, and
Yep.
they used to joke that we're actually part of a British Corps that has some NATO people on it, because there was the NATO way and there was the British way.
Right.
And, they have a British commander. So, frequently, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about that whole, yeah, how am I seen as an American,
Mhm.
and
Oh, yeah.
how, right? Like, what are the traditional trappings? I mean, when I was at the Ark, Obama was president, and the Brits, at least at that time, really loved Barack Obama, and I felt like a hero every time they would talk about our president, in a good way, and it would be kind of like, oh, okay, well, this represents my country. um, that's great, and I'm here in the UK. And but then there was always the good-natured jibbing and all the, the treason day. Whenever the 4th of July would come around, I would think, oh God, here we go. It's gonna be a whole day. It's gonna be a whole day. But anyway, yeah. So I learned a lot. But what I figured out is that there was so much, and then on to shape. There's so much that every nation does bring, and everybody's got their cool thing that they do better than everybody else.
Right.
And I often found that as an American, we're seen as being a bit cavalier, and that that we tend to think that we're going to find a way to do the whatever it is, and that I would often feel like I would get thrown the baton of, we need somebody to go do this thing. Chris, you do it, and it always felt a little bit like, I don't know if this cereal is good. Give it to Mikey. Mikey will try it. It was definitely my 70s life cereal commercials where people would give it to the American and the American. And at first I would get annoyed. And then after a while, I just kind of owned it and said, sure. Okay, good. Yeah. You want somebody to be the crazy American to go and do this? Cool.
Well, they really do see us as setting the example and being in
Yes.
front, and I don't think I understood that, and the weight and the responsibility that that carries,
Yeah.
to set that example and to be in front and to do things. But I will say that then sometimes the other nations, do a little bit more. One of the ways, and we'll see, maybe it'll be different for this international night, but we're
Oh,
about to
yeah.
have international night next week,
Oh,
and
yeah.
oh my God, the nations just go all out on
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
these tables and some of the food and the decorations and everything. I mean, that's one of the most amazing parts about being at NATO is like you just I mean, I get to bring two of my husband's volleyball friends next week, that he met in his meetup because he's out of town. He's in Egypt for the week. So
Yeah.
kiteboarding of all things. And so
Oh, wow.
uh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Cool. Yeah.
but next week it'll just be another one of those amazing opportunities. And so you had so many memories from there. So tell me a little bit about how you were able to go from serving at NATO to now you're on this path to retiring, and what got you involved in this nonprofit?
Yeah, so I was on LinkedIn, ironically enough, and I was talking to somebody who was I always been kind of a space geek, and I was talking to this person on LinkedIn that I knew that's a space geek, and
Yeah, you do a
and
lot
she
of
said,
posts
"Yeah,
on space. Yep.
what's that?"
I said you do a lot of posts on
I
space.
do love space. I love it, and I think it's just an exciting time to watch it. We got a long way from the days of like the space shuttle, right? I mean, things are
Mhm.
privatization of space has been kind of an interesting one to mull over. I could talk about that forever, but yeah, anyway, yeah, I was talking to a space geek, and she was on the panel, on a call with Dan Fine, who is this tech entrepreneur from the Pacific Northwest, Seattle area, and he was working with UWRF, which is, it's a tongue twister. I'm still looking at I think we need to rebrand, but it's the Ukraine War Animal Relief Fund. Yeah. Anyway,
Yep.
and he wanted to talk to somebody who had NATO experience because it's in Ukraine and he's sitting in Washington, and he wanted to get a little bit of feedback from me on how he could build interest in the problem that is over there. And I was on the call and opened my big mouth and I said, I really feel like that, you're worried that you're not getting American interest in this. But for most Americans, I feel, you know, it's all about the war effort that's going on there, and
Mhm.
depending on where you sit in the United States, it's good or bad. Depending where your political leaning is, it's good or bad. But they're not going to dive deep within the animal welfare part. And but I feel like in Europe it would be a thing. I feel like in Europe people will care about it because of you know, the far-reaching threat that, say, a rabies outbreak in animals could turn into a human problem. And I think people should care about that. And so I think
I
you
do
should
too.
probably go that direction. I never thought I would hear from him again. It was a 10-minute conversation that I waged, and then after that, he was interested in my thoughts and wanted to go further with that. And so then I became a part of that nonprofit kind of from that point on. And that would have been it was back last year. So then we moved, I retired, came back to Alaska, and he asked if I could take a greater role in it to kind of drive public interest in it. And that's where I came into. And yeah, so it's been a fascinating thing to kind of, I worried that I would go from a series of power jobs as a public affairs officer to sitting in admittedly a beautiful part of the world, being bored. And
Mhm.
so definitely, I was interested in helping animals, and I've always been an animal lover. And I mean, we have 4 cats and a dog in this house right now, and we always have rescues. And now I'm thinking about getting a sled dog rescue, or at least retired sled dog. Anyway, so I'm always the Hardlet story for animals. There's a cat that keeps coming around this house. I'm not sure if it's somebody's cat. Yeah. So so working with a nonprofit that goes into animal welfare, not a hard sell. Happy to do that kind of thing.
Well,
Um,
it's such a big need, and there are a lot of
yeah,
people who really don't understand how big that need is and where they can help when it comes to those issues. And animal advocacy has so much potential for people to just dive in and do something. It can be
right.
frustrating, it can be very tiring because it's a hard slog, but you meet so many amazing people. And
Oh yeah.
even here in next week, I'm going to Parliament every week. Every quarter. Mark the vet, Mark Abramson,
Yeah.
he does a like a session. It's really neat where he
Yeah.
brings together a bunch of animal advocates and people from different organizations, and then he has them all do like an elevator speech for maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes max maybe. I think it's only 10 minutes. And they only
Yeah.
show about 3 to 5 slides, and you learn so much through this
Uh-huh.
process. And they just kind of do their pitch and talk about some of the issues, and people can ask questions. And then now he even has like a company who sponsors like a social afterwards, and he's been doing this for a while, and
Oh
it
wow.
it really helps bring people together and lets people in the UK animal world know one
Mhm.
another and connect with each other. And that's the thing, is that some of these issues can be solved, but
Yeah.
they're very hard issues.
Well, I think that's Ukraine and the abandoned pets there. Like I didn't know until talking to Dan and his team of volunteers that have just done this because that's they care about it. That yeah, some 12 million. And the numbers I'm not going to be exact, right? But millions of Ukrainians had to hit the road when Russia came over the border, and they didn't bring their pets with them. And I guess prior to the war, um, Ukraine is a nation of pet lovers. They just have a lot of dogs and a lot of cats, a lot of dogs. They were not able to take those pets with. And I guess there was some kind of registers that well, Dan's a great guy, and I'll have to find it from the Lord. But he said that there was a list of nations that ranked the nations by how many pets they had per household, and that Ukraine was like in the top 5 or something. Like Ukrainians have more pets than like most countries in Europe. And so, yeah, so then they couldn't take them with, so they left the pets behind. So then you've got on the neighborhood of hundreds of thousands of dogs and
Wow.
cats that are now roaming free. They have no one to take care of them. They probably have PTSD because they get bombed and rocketed and everything else.
And they
They're
roam
trying to
around in big
survive.
packs everywhere. They're just like pack animals now. They've not even.
Right, right. And then you have the sort of perfect storm of it, where there is a sizable fox and wolf population on the border with Russia and Ukraine. So before the war, hunters could hunt. I mean, it sounds horrible, right? But they could protect livestock by hunting, fox and wolf and predators. But they can't do that now. They're prohibited. So now you've got a war. You've got a population, and oh, by the way, rabies will run through the fox population, pretty rampant. That was kept in check before the war, but now because of the war, it can't. Now you have roaming dogs, packs of dogs that were former house pets that are interacting with wild animals that have rabies, and they're contracting rabies. So now you have a rabies population, and you have an overpopulation population problem with the animals that are there. And really a lot of that effort, a lot of that problem is not in the public eye because we're worried
No.
about prosecuting a war. People are trying to stay alive and push Russia back. And so, the problem of pets really becomes not a problem, right? Like that's not something anybody, and no one's really tracking the numbers because again, they're fighting a war. They're trying to stay alive. So it's it is a significant problem, but the so what for me, and the reason why I became very interested in it was if you were to not check the rabies problem, and the rabies started to run through wild dog packs and cats, and a lot of wild, now wild feral animals that were former house pets, um, they're not really going to obey border crossings, and if they decide to migrate and go for food in different parts of the world, then they're going to run right over borders and they're going to go into other countries that, have had problems with rabies also in the past. And that could turn into more of a humanitarian thing. And particularly when I have to think as a hard luck story for a lot of rescued animals, that innately they are going to want to seek out human beings. And at some point, Ukrainians will return home, whether the war is over because Russia decides to just back the heck off and go back home or whatever. But one day people will come home. They'll look for their pets, and their pets now may have rabies or maybe wild or right. So I don't feel like anybody is looking at the long term look at that right now. And it's probably again because we're fighting, they're fighting a war. But it could go horribly south. And that's the problem is they getting people to at least see it as a problem, something they need to address. And that's been a hard sell for some
It
reason.
is. It is an
But
incredibly hard sell, but I think that there are efforts afoot to try to tell that story. I know I saw that the War Tales documentary is having a screening here in the UK.
yeah,
I
it's gonna
wanna
be in
say
London. Yep.
yeah, in London next month. I was hoping to go to it, but unfortunately I will be, I will be in Riga actually at the Stratcom Dialogues.
Oh wow.
So
Okay.
I won't be able to be there, but I would've I looked and was gonna buy a ticket, and then I saw when it was, and I was like, "Oh, I
Oh
can't
yeah.
go." But
Yeah.
I would highly encourage people to check that out. I'll share the sizzler, the teaser trailer for that, in the show
Thanks.
notes of the show, because I think that that's a story that we need to learn about, and we need to understand what some of the solutions are. Are there efforts from the nonprofit about how like some of the baby steps, like what are some of the initial steps that people could take?
Well, I mean, I'll start with the good news. I will, the good news is that there are quite a few veterinarians in Ukraine today that are happy to throw their arms into it and go and find the animals and do things. They're vet techs or veterinarians. There's a bit of a network. The organization I'm helping with UORF has that kind of link into the networks that are there. There are other agencies that are in Ukraine. Vets Without Borders is there. Um, Humane Society
Yeah, Humane Society
International has
International.
looked into
Yep.
working there, right? Yeah. So I mean, there are organizations that are doing things. There is a network. There are people that will do, but it will come down to money, and it will come down to money getting funded to pay those people to go to dangerous spots and retrieve the animals. I mean, UWRF has been over there several times. The effort that they made was was a big effort. They would all UWRF would always go in before I even started working with the organization. They would go in for a couple weeks to a month period of time. They would set a very clear goal of capturing anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 animals, and then they would spay, neuter, and vaccinate them for rabies. But then they have to release them back into the community. Like they would take a dog from a field, bring it in, nurture it a bit, make sure it's spayed, neutered, vaccinated, bathed, whatever, and then put it back in the field, right? Because that's home, you know.
Yeah.
The shelters are kind of overwhelmed right now because Ukrainian soldiers will bring pets in to shelters, because they'll see the dog wandering around and they'll bring it in. So the good part of it is there are people that care and they want to do things. The part of the negative part of it is that it's going to come down to money. And what you were found, as with a lot of the organizations, is that UWRF and others that are in Ukraine found that they were, if they are able to vaccinate 1,500 to 2,000 animals, that compare is sizable, but that compared to an estimated 400 to 500,000 animals, it ends up becoming a how much of a dent are you making into the problem? You know, so really, it needs to be a much larger effort. But in
Hmm.
order to do that, you have to convince people to go to a very dangerous space and run around, blow, with tranquilizers, blow darting animals, bringing them in, which is also dangerous, and that's it too. I mean, you were found that out. A couple of very, very talented people will go out there and blow dart these animals and then have to chase them down because you've tranquilized them, but it takes a while for it to take effect. Meanwhile, you might get rocketed or you might get shot at. So it's a dangerous thing. So it's a hard sell. But I know that there are people that are already doing things, but it's gonna require, in my opinion, it's gonna require a much larger focus on it
Hmm.
and a much larger effort in order to, because ultimately UARF and other agencies will talk about this. At the end of the day, when the war is over, people will return home. If they return home and they have now wild dog packs running through their village, then they're gonna probably shoot them, and there will be a big cull, and a lot of animals will die, and to provide safety for people who are returning home. No harm, no foul on that one. But it would be tremendously sad to think we could have probably done something about this before, and now that will be the solution. You know,
Right.
and and then the other problem, with this too, and again, there are agencies that want to do something, is you could go the other way with it and say they're probably not going to be rehomed with their original family, but there are plenty of people that will take adopted animals. But Ukraine, even before the war, was a high risk rabies country on the veterinary sort of scales. And so it was always going to be difficult to export an animal out of Ukraine. And that continues to be the problem, even more so now. But there are agencies that could vaccinate, spay, neuter, treat, do the whatever coaching they need to do to make sure that a pet is readoptable. Um, but they can't get around the policy issues between nations and how they do. So that is a different problem. But what that does mean is that animals are getting rescued, but they're going to the same kennels and languishing away in the middle of a country that's at war, right? So,
Yeah.
again, there's so many components to and the more that I have, kind of dove into it, the more I realize there is a solution. It's just, but it will probably take a lot of different people working a lot of and getting over any pre-existing conditions that prohibit them from getting along on the issue, so they can
Yeah.
get ahead of it.
Yeah, animal people are notorious for some sort of sad infighting, unfortunately, and so
Hmm.
you've probably experienced a little bit of that. Like there's definitely this idea that we should all just sing together and sing kumbaya, but a lot of times, sadly, things devolve into credit and other things, and it's
Hmm.
because a lot of these organizations too, they're on shoestring budgets and
Yeah.
donations, and so they're all just trying to go after the same small pool of people that care enough
Hmm.
about these issues that will donate. Because there's not that there is, I mean, animal issues sometimes definitely get the short end of the stick,
Yeah.
compared to some other nonprofits that like the American Cancer Association or the Heart
Oh yeah.
Association, breast cancer, or some of those major organizations that really just touch everyone.
Yeah.
Animal issues sometimes are not the ones that get some of the big funding. And so you're up against that, and you're up against an international issue. It's just harder to sell. But I do believe like the EU and some of these policymakers could be looking at this issue and could
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
talking about this issue and could be coming up with small initiatives, even in their own organizations, to address this issue. So I
Yeah.
do hope if any of those kinds of people are listening to this podcast or can come up with ideas or can be a part of this, it's a fight worth being part of.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Teresa. It is, whether you just care about the animals or you want to prohibit, you want to prevent a disease from running rampant. through a population. And sadly, a lot of the people that are in Ukraine that are contracting rabies from prior pets are children.
Yeah.
So, and I have a hard time with that. I have a
Yeah,
hard
it has
time with,
there's a human cost to it, definitely, not
right.
just an
There's,
animal
there's
cost.
so I feel like there's a lot of different parts to this that it's just about getting people kind of interested in it and then wanting to do something about it. And look, whatever your political leaning, I feel like most people care about animals.
Right,
And so I feel like it's an issue that doesn't require political leaning. It's just say, let's go save the animals on this one and save us.
right.
So
And let's yeah, these were family pets. These were
yeah,
the same pets like I have in the other room, and they're family members, and
yeah,
these were people's family members that were left
yeah,
behind,
yep.
and we gotta do what we need to do to help take care of them. So, I think what you're doing is great, Chris. I
Mhm.
just I appreciate you so much and
Well,
love
thanks.
the chance that we had to have this conversation. Is there anything else that, we can leave our audience with, or anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to address?
I know. I thinking about it. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, it's been great to talk to you. Yes, we're good friends, and again, this whole friendship that we've got is built on a career that we both decided to go into. We both happen to end up in, more or less the same spot in the world,
Yeah,
and again, I feel like that has always been my pull to this career, and I'm now, seeking, say, UWorth will be one, but whatever else I get into here, it's all going to be in a collaborative environment where I can try to make things better. And I think it's always been what pulled me into the military in the first place, is trying to be something, part of something bigger than yourself. It's not all about you, it's about the cause. um so yeah, so I appreciate our friendship and the fact that we've been now talking now for a couple of years,
yeah,
and
me too.
yeah, it's been cool.
Yeah, and so if people wanna know more about, the nonprofit, it is, I'll link to it here, but I'll also show it on here on a share screen real quick so people can see the website, but it's the Ukraine War Animals Fund. So you see it right here, and this is the news article that I put on LinkedIn a couple days ago, and, there's just some more information about the charity. The War Tales documentary is coming out soon. I think that's going to be really helpful to get some
Yeah,
people a little bit more familiar with the mission. But please go check it out. Like I say, I linked to it in the show notes. And if you guys have any questions for Chris, guys know where to reach him. He's on LinkedIn. He's on all my social media places. So please reach out to him for any more questions or anything. But thank you so much, Chris, for joining the podcast.
yeah, thanks, Teresa, I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for this opportunity to talk and chat, and yeah, thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to go full screen, but meet me backstage. I do want to say goodbye real quick. But thank you guys for joining the SOS broadcast. I will be back, I believe, next week. But if not, and take care of yourselves. Uh, as I always say, take care of each other, take care of yourselves. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Bye bye now.